The air in the grand ballroom smelled of expensive lilies and desperation. It was a scent I had known my entire life. The smell of my sister, Clara, getting exactly what she wanted. Golden light dripped from the chandeliers, casting long, elegant shadows across the marble floor, but none of that warmth seemed to reach the corner where I stood. I adjusted my silk shawl, the fabric cold against my skin, and watched the sea of tuxedos move in a synchronized dance of high society perfection. To anyone else, this was a wedding of the year. To me, it was a funeral for a relationship that had died a long time ago. I stood by the heavy oak doors, a ghost in a well-tailored dress. I watched my mother laugh, her hand resting delicately on the arm of the senator, her eyes bright with the kind of pride she usually reserved for looking in the mirror. My father was nearby, holding a crystal glass of scotch that probably cost more than my monthly rent, nodding along to a joke he didn't care about. They looked complete. They looked like a portrait of a happy family, provided you didn't look for the empty space where a second daughter should be. I remember the way the invitation had arrived, stiff, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil lettering. It hadn't been mailed. It had been left on my kitchen counter by my mother during one of her rare 3-minute check-ins. She hadn't even stayed for tea. She just placed it there, like a summons to a court hearing where the verdict had already been decided. "Be there by 4, Elena," she had said, not looking at me, "and try to blend in. This is Clara's day. Don't make it about your struggles." My struggles. That was her code for my existence. My life. The way I had quietly built my own path while Clara burned to the family's patience and cash. It was all just a messy situation that threatened to stain the pristine white fabric of Clara's big moment. As the string quartet began a soft, weeping rendition of a classic Vivaldi piece, the usher approached me. He was young, perhaps 20, with white gloves and a nervous smile. He looked at my name tag, then at his clipboard, then back at me. A flicker of confusion, or maybe pity, crossed his face. "Ms. Elena Vance," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the opulence surrounding us. "That's me," I said, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. He didn't lead me toward the front rows where the mahogany chairs were draped in white satin. He didn't lead me toward the family section where my parents sat, radiating golden authority. Instead, he turned his back on the light and began walking toward the shadowed corridor that led to the kitchens and the restrooms. I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up my spine. The music faded behind us, replaced by the muffled clatter of plates and the distant, sharp bark of the catering manager. We stopped in the narrow hallway, where the carpet ended and the linoleum began. There, tucked between a fire extinguisher and a stack of folded high chairs, sat a single metal folding chair with my name taped to the back. The usher gestured to it, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Your sister," she said, "this was the only place left where you wouldn't be an eyesore." The metal of the chair felt like ice through my dress. I sat there, the hum of the industrial refrigerator in the kitchen providing a low, buzzing soundtrack to my isolation. Every time the double doors swung open, a gust of humid air carrying the smell of seared scallops and frantic shouting hit me, followed by a fleeting glimpse of the golden world I wasn't allowed touch. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, which surprised me. I had spent 28 years being the other daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't need the spotlight because I was too busy keeping the foundation from cracking. I remember being 7, standing in the hallway of our old estate, watching Clara throw a tantrum because her birthday cake had the wrong shade of pink frosting. My parents hadn't scolded her. They had knelt, frantic and pleading, promising her a trip to Paris to make up for the trauma. I had stood in the doorway, holding a scraped knee from a fall in the garden, waiting for someone to notice the blood trickling down my leg. No one did. I eventually walked to the bathroom, climbed onto a stool, and bandaged myself. That was the day I learned that in the Vance family, pain was only valid if it was loud. If you suffered in silence, you suffered alone. The hallway light flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over my lap. It was a stark contrast to the way the photographers were currently bathing Clara in soft, expensive flashes just 30 feet away. I could hear the muffled sound of my father's voice now, giving the first toast. He was talking about legacy and the beauty of a daughter who follows her heart. A bitter taste rose in my throat. Clara hadn't followed her heart. She had followed the path of least resistance, paved with our father's connections and my mother's manipulation. And now, she was marrying a man who looked at her like she was a trophy, unaware that the pedestal he was placing her on was built of borrowed wood. I reached into my small clutch bag and felt the edge of a thick, embossed envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew every word written on the documents inside. They were the papers my husband, now my ex-husband in every way that mattered, had thrown at me 3 weeks ago. I need someone who matches my ambition. Elena, Marcus had said, his voice as cold as the marble in this hallway. Someone who belongs in the rooms I'm finally entering. You're just content. And content doesn't build empires. He was upstairs right now, probably standing at the bar with Claire's bridesmaids, laughing about the broke wife he had finally shed. He didn't know that the empire he was so proud of was currently sitting on a fault line. He didn't know that the content wife he despised was the only reason the ground hadn't swallowed him whole yet. Suddenly, the kitchen doors burst open. A waitress, breathless and red-faced, nearly tripped over my feet. She looked at me, then at the chair, then at the fire extinguisher. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her voice thick with genuine pity. "Are you supposed to be here?" I looked up at her and gave a small, sharp smile. "I'm exactly where they want me to be," I said. "For now." The waitress didn't linger. She couldn't. The machine of a 5-star wedding waits for no one's pity. She hurried off, the swinging doors slapping shut behind her, cutting off the smell of roasting garlic and the frantic barking of the head chef. Once again, I was alone with the hum of the vending machine and the distant, muffled roar of 100 people celebrating a union built on a lie. I looked at the floor. The linoleum was scuffed, marked by the heavy black boots of delivery men and the frantic heels of overworked staff. It was the backstage of life, the place where the ugly things were kept so the guests didn't have to lose their appetite. I checked my watch. 4:45 p.m. The ceremony was over. The cocktail hour was in full swing. In the ballroom, my sister was likely holding a glass of vintage champagne, tilting her head back to laugh. So the light hit her diamond necklace just right. That necklace had been a family heirloom, or so my mother claimed. In reality, I knew the jeweler who had crafted it 3 months ago, and I knew exactly which account had paid for it. It hadn't been my father's. I stood up, my joints feeling stiff. I needed to move, to feel the floor beneath my feet, to remind myself that I wasn't actually a ghost. I walked toward the end of the hallway, where a heavy velvet curtain separated the service corridor from the main gallery. I didn't step through. I just pulled the fabric back an inch. The transition was jarring. The air on the other side was 10 degrees warmer, scented with expensive perfume and the crisp, ozone smell of high-end air conditioning. I saw Marcus. He was standing near a marble pillar, his arm draped casually around the waist of a woman I didn't recognize, though her dress cost more than my car. He looked lighter, free. He was holding court, gesturing with a gold-rimmed glass as he spoke to a group of investors I had spent 3 years courting for him. "It's all about the exit strategy," I heard him say, his voice carrying over the soft violin music. "You have to know when to cut the dead weight if you want the ship to move faster." The dead weight. The investors chuckled, nodding in agreement. They didn't see me watching. They didn't see the woman who had stayed up until 3 a.m. for 40 nights straight, rewriting his business proposals, fixing his accounting errors, and using my own maiden name to bridge the gaps in his credit. To them, I was a quiet wife who stayed home. To Marcus, I was a ladder he was done climbing. I let the curtain fall. The darkness of the hallway felt safer now. I walked back to my metal chair, but someone was already there. My mother was standing by the fire extinguisher, her arms crossed over her shimmering silver gown. She looked out of place against the cinder block walls, like a tropical bird trapped in a cellar. She didn't look sad to find me there. She looked annoyed that she had to walk this far to find me. "Elena," she said, her voice sharp, "what are you doing? You're lurking. People will notice." Lurking? I gestured to the chair with my name taped to it. "I'm sitting exactly where the usher told me to sit, Mom. Or, did you forget where you put me?" She didn't flinch. She just adjusted her pearl earring. Clara was very stressed about the seating chart. She felt that having you at the main table would be awkward, given the divorce, and Marcus being here with his new partner. It's for your own comfort, really. My comfort, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. Yes, she said, finally looking me in the eye. Her gaze was cold, devoid of any maternal warmth. Now, stay here. Don't cause a scene. We have a reputation to maintain today. Don't ruin this for your sister. She turned to leave, but stopped, her back to me. And Elena, don't drink too much. We don't need you getting emotional. She vanished behind the velvet curtain, leaving me in the silence of the hallway. But the silence didn't last long. I heard the click-clack of expensive heels approaching from the opposite direction, from the bridal suite. The door at the end of the hall creaked open, and there she was, the bride, Clara. Clara looked like a vision in ivory lace, a masterpiece of artificial perfection. But as she stepped onto the dull linoleum of the service hallway, the illusion flickered. Her face wasn't glowing with bridal joy. It was tight, twisted into a look of pure, concentrated disdain. She held her heavy train in one hand, bunching the expensive fabric as if she couldn't wait to be rid of it. She stopped 5 feet away from my metal chair, her shadow stretching long and thin across the scuffed floor. "Still here, Elena?" she asked, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "I thought you might have had the grace to slip out the back by now. God knows you look like you belong with the dishwashers." I didn't stand up. I stayed seated on that cold folding chair, looking up at her. The usher said this was my assigned seat. "Clara, I'm just following the rules of the house." She let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The rules? The rule is that this is my night, my wedding, my moment. And look at you, sitting here like a dark cloud, trying to make everyone feel guilty with that pathetic martyr look on your face." She stepped closer, the smell of her floral perfume clashing violently with the scent of the industrial floor cleaner. "Let's be honest. You're only here because you have nowhere else to go. Marcus dumped you because you're boring. Mom and Dad tolerate you because they have to. You're the backup daughter, Elena, the one we keep in the hallway, so the real guests don't have a trip over your failures." I felt the familiar sting in my chest, the one I'd carried since we were children, the one that told me I was smaller, dimmer, less than. But today, the sting was different. It didn't burn, it froze. "Is that what you told Marcus?" I asked quietly. "That I was a failure?" Clara smirked, adjusting a loose pin in her veil. "I didn't have to tell him anything. He saw it himself. He's a winner, Elena. He belongs with people like us. People who actually own things, not people who work for a living and pretend it's a career." She leaned down, her face inches from mine. "Do you know what he told me during the rehearsal dinner? He said being married to you felt like being anchored to a sinking ship. He said the moment he signed those papers, he felt like he could finally breathe." She straightened up, smoothing her skirt with a satisfied flick of her wrists. "So, do us all a favor. Stay in your hole. Eat your cold chicken when the waiters bring it out. And when the cake is cut, leave through the kitchen door. Don't let the photographers catch a glimpse of you. I don't want a single glitch in my wedding album." She turned on her heel, her silk train sweeping across the dirty floor, picking up dust as she marched back toward the ballroom. She didn't look back. She didn't see me reach into my bag and touch the corner of the envelope again. I closed my eyes for a second, listening to the roar of the crowd as she re-entered the ballroom, the cheering, the clapping, the toast of the perfect bride. I looked at the fire extinguisher. I looked at the stack of high chairs. Then I looked at the gold-embossed envelope in my lap. Clara thought she was the one who owned the room. Marcus thought he was the one who owned the future. They both thought I was the dead weight, being cut loose. I stood up, the metal chair screeching against the floor. I wasn't going to the kitchen, and I certainly wasn't going to wait for the cold chicken. I had a phone call to make, a call to a board of directors who were currently waiting for a single word from me to freeze every asset Marcus thought he possessed. The hallway felt smaller now, the walls closing in like the sides of a casket. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, grounding me. For years, I had played the role of the quiet observer, the one who buffered the blows and smoothed the edges of my family's chaos. I had been the silent partner in Marcus's rise, the ghostwriter of his success. But as I stood there, the screech of that metal chair still echoing in my ears. Something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a clean, silent severance. I pulled my phone from my clutch. The screen glowed, a sharp blue light against the dim corridor. I had one contact pinned at the top, Mr. Sterling. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was the keeper of my grandfather's true legacy, the one he had skipped over my father and Clara to leave to me. I looked at the ballroom doors. I could hear Marcus's voice again, louder now, probably bolstered by a third glass of scotch. He was laughing. That booming, confident laugh that used to make me feel safe, but now sounded like the grinding of gears. He thinks the merger goes through at midnight. I whispered to the empty hallway. I tapped the call button. It picked up on the first ring. Ms. Vance! Sterling's voice was gravelly and precise. I've been waiting. The board is assembled in the city. They're expecting the final authorization for the capital injection into Marcus's firm. Change of plans, Arthur. I said, my voice steadied and I felt. I want you to pull the Vanguard clause. Every cent of the trust is to be decoupled from his accounts immediately. Not at midnight. Now. There was a brief pause on the other end. Elena, you realize that without your family's backing, his firm's valuation will drop to nearly zero by morning. He's leveraged everything on the assumption that you are his silent guarantor. I'm no longer silent, Arthur, and I'm certainly not his guarantor. Understood, Sterling replied, a hint of a smile in his tone. And what about the property? The penthouse, the office lease, the vineyard? They're all held by the trust, aren't they? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Technically, they are yours. He's been living in a house of cards, and you own the table. Fold the table, Arthur. Let the cards fall where they may. I hung up. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass. I looked down at my dress. It was a deep, muted navy, the color of the ocean at midnight. Clara had called it dull. I now realized it was the color of a storm. I didn't leave through the kitchen door like I was told. Instead, I walked back toward the ballroom. I didn't enter, but I stood just behind the heavy velvet curtain. Through the gap, I saw Marcus and Clara standing together, the power couple of the evening. My mother was beaming, her hand on Marcus's shoulder as if he were the son she actually wanted. They were all so sure of their victory. They were celebrating a future that, at this very moment, was being erased from a digital ledger 300 miles away. I realized then that they didn't just underestimate my bank account. They underestimated my resolve. They thought that because I was kind, I was weak. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't the invisible guest anymore. I was the architect of their upcoming reality. But as I turned to finally walk away, a hand caught my elbow. It was my father. He looked frantic, his face pale, holding his buzzing phone like it was a live grenade. Elena, he hissed, his voice trembling. Something is happening. The bank, they just called. They're saying the trust is being liquidated. Tell me you didn't. My father's grip on my arm was tight, his fingers digging into the navy silk of my sleeve. This was the most attention he'd paid me in a decade, and it was born entirely of panic. His phone continued to vibrate, a frantic heartbeat in the palm of his hand. I did exactly what was necessary, Dad. I said, my voice is level as a horizon. I'm just simplifying his state. Isn't that what you always taught me? Remove the liabilities. Liabilities? He gasped, looking around to ensure no guests were watching our confrontation in the shadows of the velvet curtain. Marcus's firm is a cornerstone of our family's new portfolio. If that trust moves, the credit lines collapse. Your sister's lifestyle, this wedding, my reputation, it's all tied to that capital. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fine lines of age and the frantic vanity in his eyes. He didn't care that his daughter had been seated next to a fire extinguisher. He didn't care that my husband had traded me in for a newer model. He only cared about the portfolio. That capital was never yours, Dad. I reminded him gently. Grandfather knew exactly who would spend it and who would protect it. You and Clara are spenders. I was the one who grew it. A memory flashed through my mind, unbidden. 10 years ago, the summer after I graduated, I had found discrepancy in the family accounts. Clara had been borrowing tens of thousands to fund a boutique that never opened. When I showed the proof to my father, he didn't thank me. He burned the ledger in the fireplace and told me that family loyalty is more important than math. He had been protecting her even then. He had spent 10 years letting her bleed the family dry, while I quietly worked 2 jobs to refill the bucket. "You don't understand the optics of this," he hissed, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. "Marcus is about to announce a massive expansion. If the funds vanish now, it looks like fraud. You're destroying him." "No," I corrected, pulling my arm out of his grasp. He destroyed himself the moment he decided I was dead weight. I'm just stopping the subsidy. Behind us, the music swelled. The DJ announced the couple's first dance. The double doors creaked open, and a flood of golden light spilled into our dark corner. I saw Marcus lead Clara to the center of the floor. They looked like royalty under the spotlights, their smiles radiant, their movements fluid. Marcus caught my eye for a split second across the room. He didn't look guilty. He gave me a smirk, a small, triumphant tilt of the lips that said, "Look at what I have now." He didn't know that the watch on his wrist was technically no longer his. He didn't know that the very floor he was dancing on was part of a venue lease that my trust had just canceled. "Fix this, Elena," my father pleaded, his voice breaking. "If you do this, there's no coming back. You'll be an outcast. You'll have nothing but that money." I looked at the happy couple one last time, then back at the man who had failed to be a father. "I've been an outcast in this family since the day I was born," I said. "The only difference is that now I'm an outcast who owns a house." I turned and walked away, not toward the exit, but toward the bridal suite. I had one more gift to leave for my sister, a gift that would ensure she remembered this wedding for the rest of her life. The bridal suite was a disaster zone, a discarded luxury. Empty champagne bottles sat like fallen soldiers on the vanity, and a trail of white rose petals led toward the oversized mirror. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray and Clara's overwhelming ego. It was the inner sanctum of the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my shadow to reach the sun. I walked over to the mahogany vanity. Amidst the scattered lipsticks and diamond hairpins sat a small, velvet box. It was my gift, not the one I had sent from the registry, the expensive crystal vases that Mother had insisted on, but the one I had carried in my coat pocket. I placed a single cream-colored envelope on top of the box. Inside wasn't checked, and it wasn't a heartfelt card. It was a forensic audit of the boutique Clara claimed to be running, the one she used to funnel investments from Marcus's firm. For months, Marcus had been bragging to board about a lucrative retail subsidiary. He didn't realize his new bride was using it as a personal slush fund to buy the very jewels she was wearing tonight. She wasn't just his partner. She was his biggest financial leak. They were 2 predators who had accidentally started eating each other. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't look tired. I didn't look like the boring wife or the invisible sister. I looked like a woman who had finally stopped carrying everyone else's luggage. I remembered a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago. I had been sick with the flu, shivering in bed, while Marcus was out closing a deal. I found out later he was actually at a jewelry auction with Clara, picking out a birthday gift for her using our joint savings. When I confronted him, he told me I was being paranoid and unsupportive. He had made me feel small for being right. I picked up a gold lipstick from the vanity, Clara's favorite shade. I didn't use it. I simply turned it until the red wax snapped off and fell to the floor. A small, petty gesture, perhaps, but it felt remarkably good. As I turned to leave, the door swung open. It wasn't Clara. It was Marcus's mistress, the woman he had brought to the wedding as his business associate. She was younger than me, draped in a dress that was held together by hope and expensive tailoring. She froze when she saw me, her hand going to the fake diamond necklace at her throat. "Oh," she stammered, her eyes darting to the velvet box on the vanity. I was just looking for a mirror." I smiled at her. It wasn't a mean smile. It was almost kind. "Don't worry. You're in the right place. This room is full of mirrors. The problem is, no one here likes what they see." I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers. A word of advice, I whispered, Check the return policy on that dress. You're gonna need the cash by Monday. I left her standing there, confused and blinking, and stepped back into the hallway. The music from the ballroom was reaching a crescendo. The big reveal was coming, but it wouldn't be the one they planned. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Arthur. The freeze is active. The board has called an emergency meeting for 9 p.m. tonight. Marcus's access has been revoked. The storm hadn't just arrived. It was already inside the building. I walked down the long, carpeted gallery toward the main exit, my footsteps muffled and heavy. The sound of the celebration was behind me now, a dull roar that felt miles away. I stopped at the coat check, where a young woman with tired eyes handed me my trench coat. She didn't know who I was. To her, I was just another guest leaving early. Perhaps someone who couldn't handle their liquor, or someone who had a long drive ahead. I didn't look back at the ballroom. I didn't need to see the glitter one last time. I stepped through the heavy glass front doors and out into the night. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the coming rain. It was a relief to breathe something that didn't smell like lilies or expensive perfume. I stood under the portico, watching the valet park a line of luxury SUVs. These were the cars of people who believed that wealth was a permanent state of being, not a temporary gift from a trust fund they didn't control. My phone buzzed again. It was a call from Marcus. I let it ring. Then it buzzed again. And again. He was finally trying to use his corporate card for a surprise honeymoon suite upgrade he bragged about. Or perhaps he'd just received the automated alert that his primary business account had been flagged for unauthorized access. I watched the red decline button glow on my screen until it went dark. I remember the early days of our marriage, sitting on the floor of our first tiny apartment, eating takeout on packing boxes. I had been so happy then, believing we were building something together. I didn't realize that while I was laying bricks, Marcus was already looking for a faster elevator. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a silent engine. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a rideshare. It was a private car Arthur had sent. The driver stepped out, nodding to me with the kind of practiced discretion that only comes with a high salary. "Ms. Vance, we're ready when you are." I opened the door, but before I stepped in, I paused. Across the lawn, I could see the high, arched windows of the ballroom. The lights inside flickered as the DJ began the high-energy dance set. From this distance, it looked like a dollhouse, bright, fragile, and entirely artificial. In about 20 minutes, the venue manager would approach my father. He would politely inform him that the secondary deposit for the open bar had failed. Then Marcus would get a call from his head of operations, screaming about a liquidity crisis that had frozen their payroll. The transition from the wedding of the year to the scandal of the decade was going to be remarkably fast. I sat back in the leather seat of the car and closed my eyes. The engine purred as we pulled away from the curb, leaving the lights of the estate behind. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering what my mother would think or if Clara would be angry. I wasn't worrying about Marcus's ego or my father's reputation. I was thinking about tomorrow morning. I was thinking about the boardroom table and the chair at the head of it that had been empty for far too long. The driver glanced at me in the rear-view mirror. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "Everything is perfect," I said. "It's just a very quiet night." But I knew the quiet wouldn't last. Back at the wedding, the first cracks were already beginning to show. The car glided away from the estate, but my mind remained anchored to the ballroom for one final, devastating moment. I didn't need to be there to see it. I had spent a lifetime studying the physics of my family's ego. I knew exactly how it would shatter. Back inside, the music likely cut out first. I could imagine the scene with surgical precision. The DJ, a man who worked for tips and a contract, would have been the first to receive the stop work order on his tablet. The upbeat pop song would have grown to a halt, leaving only the sound of 100 confused voices and the clinking of silverware. Then the lights, not a blackout, but the harsh, unforgiving work lights that venues use to signal the end of the night. The golden glow of the chandeliers replaced by a clinical white glare that showed the dust on the floor and the sweat on the guests' faces. In the center of it all would be Marcus. His phone would be a frantic beacon in his hand. I could see him standing by the bar, his face flushed with the kind of rage he usually reserved for his subordinates. He would be trying to pay for the premium bottle service he'd just ordered for his new associates. He would swipe his black card once, twice, a third time. System error, the bartender would say, his voice flat, unaffected by Marcus's supposed importance. Then would come the whisper. It would start at the edges of the room and move inward like a rising tide. The van's fortune wasn't just stalling, it was evaporating. I looked out the window of the sedan as we hit the highway. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, a graveyard of ambitions. I wondered if Clara had found the envelope yet. I wondered if she was standing in that disaster of a bridal suite, looking at the audit that proved she had been stealing from a man she just swore to cherish. Two predators, married for an hour, realizing they had both married a bank account that no longer existed. My phone chimed. It was a video message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a shaky 5-second clip, clearly taken by a disgruntled server. It showed my father red-faced and shouting at the venue manager, while my mother sat in a chair, her head in her hands, her shimmering silver gown looking like cheap tinsel in the harsh light. But it was Marcus's face that stayed with me. He looked smaller. The expensive tailoring of his suit couldn't hide the way his shoulders had slumped. He looked like a man who had just realized a ladder he'd been climbing wasn't leaning against a wall. It was leaning against a cloud. He had called me dead weight. He had thought that by cutting me loose, he would soar. He didn't realize that I wasn't the weight holding him down. I was a parachute that had been keeping him from hitting the ground. The driver turned onto the bridge, the tires humming against the metal. "We're 10 minutes out from the office, Ms. Vance," he said. "Thank you," I replied. I felt a strange pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sadness. It was a heavy, tectonic shift of reality. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about the wedding disaster. The family would call me a traitor. Marcus would call me a monster. But as the city lights blurred past, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an invitation to the table. I was the one who owned the room. The car glided away from the estate, but my mind remained anchored to the ballroom for one final, devastating moment. I didn't need to be there to see it. I had spent a lifetime studying the physics of my family's ego. I knew exactly how it would shatter. Back inside, the music likely cut out first. I could imagine the scene with surgical precision. The DJ, a man who worked for tips in a contract, would have been the first to receive the stop work order on his tablet. The upbeat pop song would have grown to a halt, leaving only the sound of 100 confused voices and a clinking of silverware. Then the lights, not a blackout, but the harsh, unforgiving work lights that venues use to signal the end of the night. The golden glow of the chandeliers replaced by a clinical white glare that showed the dust on the floor and the sweat on the guests' faces. In the center of it all would be Marcus. His phone would be a frantic beacon in his hand. I could see him standing by the bar, his face flushed with the kind of rage he usually reserved for his subordinates. He would be trying to pay for the premium bottle service he'd just ordered for his new associates. He would swipe his black card once, twice, a third time. System error, the bartender would say, his voice flat, unaffected by Marcus's supposed importance. Then would come the whisper. It would start at the edges of the room and move inward like a rising tide. The van's fortune wasn't just stalling, it was evaporating. I looked out the window of the sedan as we hit the highway. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, a graveyard of ambitions. I wondered if Clara had found the envelope yet. I wondered if she was standing in that disaster of a bridal suite, looking at the audit that proved she had been stealing from a man she just swore to cherish. Two predators, married for an hour, realizing they had both married a bank account that no longer existed. My phone chimed. It was a video message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a shaky 5-second clip, clearly taken by a disgruntled server. It showed my father red-faced and shouting at the venue manager, while my mother sat in a chair, her head in her hands, her shimmering silver gown looking like cheap tinsel in the harsh light. But it was Marcus's face that stayed with me. He looked smaller. The expensive tailoring of his suit couldn't hide the way his shoulders had slumped. He looked like a man who had just realized a ladder he'd been climbing wasn't leaning against a wall. It was leaning against a cloud. He had called me dead weight. He had thought that by cutting me loose, He would soar. He didn't realize that I wasn't the weight holding him down. I was the parachute that had been keeping him from hitting the ground. The driver turned onto the bridge, the tires humming against the metal. "We're 10 minutes out from the office, Miss Vance," he said. "Thank you," I replied. I felt a strange pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sadness. It was a heavy, tectonic shift of reality. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about the wedding disaster. The family would call me a traitor. Marcus would call me a monster. But as the city lights blurred past, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an invitation to the table. I was the one who owned the room. The boardroom was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled siren of a city that never sleeps. I spent the next 3 hours signing documents that effectively erased the life Marcus had spent years carefully curating. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a layer of my old self, the invisible girl, the dead weight, falling away. By midnight, it was done. The firm was stabilized under the trust umbrella, and Marcus was officially a stranger to the company he had called his own. I stepped back into the elevator, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind humming with a strange, sharp clarity. When I reached the lobby, I saw a figure pacing near the glass doors. It was my mother. She looked smaller than she had at the wedding. The silver gown was wrinkled, and her perfect hair was beginning to fray at the edges. When she saw me, she didn't rush to hug me. She rushed to accuse me. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "The police were there. Elena." They stopped the music. They made us leave through the service entrance because the bill wasn't settled. "Do you have any idea what this does to our name? Clara is hysterical. She's locked herself in a hotel room, and Marcus is gone. He just walked away into the dark." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to apologize for breathing. "The name was already hollow, Mom," I said. "You were just the only ones who hadn't realized it yet. You built a life out of appearances and expected me to be the glue holding the lies together. I'm done being the glue." "You've left us with nothing," she sobbed, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life raft. "I've left you with exactly what you gave me," I replied. "The truth, what you do with it now is up to you." I walked past her, out into the cool night air. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I knew she wasn't. She was already looking for someone else to blame, someone else to fix the mess she had helped create. I took a long walk through the city streets. The neon signs blurred into streaks of light, and the sound of my own footsteps became a steady, comforting rhythm. I ended up at a small, 24-hour diner, a place Marcus would have never stepped foot in. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the early morning delivery trucks start their rounds. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from an unknown number, but I knew the cadence of the words. It was Clara. "I hope you're happy," it read. "You destroyed everything. You were always jealous of me. You'll always be the girl in the hallway." I didn't delete the message. I didn't reply. I simply turned off the phone and set it on the table. She was right about one thing. I was a girl in the hallway. But the hallway isn't just a place to hide. It's the path that leads to every other room in the house. And while they were busy posing in the ballroom, I was the one who learned how the doors were locked. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a bruised, beautiful purple. The wedding of the year was a ghost story now, a cautionary tale for the elite. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and looked at my reflection in the diner window. The woman looking back wasn't a backup daughter or a boring wife. She was a woman who had finally decided to live her own life, regardless of who was watching. The city was waking up. The first rays of gold sliced through the skyscrapers, hitting the puddles on the pavement, and making them shimmer like the diamonds Clara used to flaunt. I stepped out of the diner, the cool morning air hitting my face. The world looked different today. The building seemed less intimidating. The streets seemed wider. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking in someone else's shadow. I was casting my own. I walked toward the park, a place where no one knew the name Vance, and no one cared about legacy. I sat on a wooden bench, watching an old man feed the pigeons and a young runner push past her limits. They were real. Their struggles were visible, and their victories were earned. I thought about Marcus. I wondered where he had slept last night, or if he had slept at all. He had spent so long building a life based on the exit strategy, never realizing that the person he was exiting was the only one holding the door open. He would try to rebuild, no doubt. He would find another bridge to cross and another person to use. But he would never again have the trust of the woman who saw him for exactly who he was. And Clara, my sister, the bride who won a fairy tale and ended up with a forensic audit. I hoped, in some small way, that the silence of that hotel room would finally force her to look at a mirror that didn't lie. But I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box I had taken from the bridal suite. I hadn't opened it yet. I clicked the latch. Inside was a simple gold ring. It wasn't a family heirloom, and it wasn't encrusted with stones. It was my grandmother's wedding band, the one she had left to me in a private letter I'd hidden for years. She had been the only one who saw the strength in my quietness. To the one who keeps the hearth, the note had said, "May you eventually find a fire worth tending." I slipped the ring onto my finger. It was warm from the sun. I wasn't tending anyone else's fire anymore. I was aflame. I looked at my phone one last time before dropping it into a trash can near the park exit. I didn't need the messages, the apologies, or the threats. I had a new number, a new firm, and a life that didn't require permission from a seating chart. I started to walk. I didn't have a destination yet, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. I was no longer the girl in the hallway, waiting for the door to open. I was the one with the keys. As I blended into the morning crowd, a ghost no more, I couldn't help but wonder about the people I left behind in that ballroom. They are still there in a way, trapped in a cycle of needing to be seen, needing to be envied, and needing to be right. But what about you? Have you ever been the invisible one in your own life? Have you ever sat in the hallway while someone else took the credit for the foundation you built? Maybe it's time to stop waiting for them to notice you. Maybe it's time to realize that the most powerful person in the room is often the one they forgot to count. What would you do if you realized you held all the cards?